Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this meeting of the Perth Kinross Council Local Review Body. Can I please inform all members of the public and officers that today's meeting will be recorded and will be available on the Council's website following the meeting. Can I also ask if any of you have a mobile device, can you please either switch it off or certainly switch it to silent? I'm Councillor Lewis Simpson. I'm the convener of the local review body, and I'm joined today on my right by Councillor Henry Anderson and on my left by Councillor Tom Gray. On my far right is Mr. David Harrison, who is the planning advisor to the LRB. He is not part of the planning department and has had no previous involvement in any of the applications on the agenda today. On my left is Mr. Jeff Fogg, who is the legal advisor to the LRB, and on my far left is Mr. Danny Williams of Committee Services. We're also joined in the front row by Christine Bryan from the Planning Department, who will take back any learning points to her colleagues in the Planning Department. And most important of all, in the back row, we have Mina, who's in charge of the IT, which is going to work today. It is going to work today because we need it for the photographs, and I hope you can all see the screens, and also for the recording on YouTube. Colleagues, can I ask if there are any declarations of interest by members on any item on the agenda today? No interests. Can I also note for this meeting, just to give you an idea, we have no idea how long this meeting will last. We will consider the weighty documents very carefully, and in any case, we'll have a recess at approximately 12:30 for half an hour. We will then return raring to go. But that gives you an idea of how the morning will go. So the minute of the previous meeting, can we note the minute of the last meeting, colleagues?
Happy to note.
Noted, that's fine. So we'll move to the first item in today's agenda, item 4.1, which is a planning application for the erection of ancillary accommodation, Bracklin, somewhere I can't pronounce, in Pitlochry. So can I ask if the applicant or agent for this one is here? No one here from that. Right. Can I ask you, Mr. Harrison, to introduce the application for review?
Thank you, Convener. Can I first of all check that people can hear what I'm saying? That's fine. Thank you. As you say, this is a detailed planning application for the erection of ancillary accommodation at Bracklin. Again, at somewhere I'm difficulty pronouncing because it's in Gaelic. I think it's Coolbray in Pitlochry. The proposed accommodation unit would be sited on a steeply sloping area containing mature trees. The building would provide a carport and store at ground floor level, an open plan living area with kitchen facilities, shower room and store at first floor level, and a bedroom at second floor level. It would have mono-pitched roof design of profiled steel with walls clad in untreated larch boarding. Retaining walls would be formed using gabion baskets. A large deck supported by columns and with a glass balustrade would be set at first floor level. It rises some 9 metres above the level of the shared access. I'll just take you to the photographs now, but you might like to have pages 33 onwards, which will provide you with a location plan, a site plan, and drawings of the building. The general sequence of the photographs will be the site and the access, and then the various adjoining properties. So I say this is the applicant's house at the moment, Bracklin, and it's as seen from the shared access. The arrows will give you a general direction for as it were, the drift of the photographs as we go on. So going slightly to the right of that, we're looking up the boundary again of the application site and the hedge there where you see the sign. And the next photograph, I say from that shared access approach, will be at the gates you see on that red line boundary. So just moving up from that, we see the gates at that point going into the, shall we say, the parking and turning area, and of course we see the extension and the decking area referred to in the papers as part of that photograph. Swinging round a little bit to the right of that, we then look across that shared access road again to the hedge which encloses the adjoining property referred to in the papers, Kaluna, but you're still catching the application site as it goes in towards the woodland beyond. Moving on from that, we go a little bit further up until we get to the driveway into Kaluna. gives you an indication of the front area of that property. Swinging round to the left of that photograph, we'll still catch the corner of the driveway, but we see the main part of the application site. Moving on again towards the application site, you'll notice that there's a strip of land which is unidentified as belonging to one property or the other between the application site and the boundary of Kaluna. Swinging to the left of that, and having stepped into the shared access a little bit further, we can now look across that land towards the gable of Kaluna. And swinging to the right of that photograph slightly, we step back a little bit again and we see the whole of that frontage of the application site as it fronts onto the shared access. And you can probably just pick up the car parking area associated with the property beyond in that photograph as well. So that's the main body of the application site. Swinging to the left of that photograph again and stepping back a little bit as well, we're looking across the whole application site again in the direction of Kaluna. Swinging to the left of that, we catch that boundary of the application site as it rises, as it were, and we're still looking at the parking area as well, of course. Swinging again to the left of that photograph, we get the area beside the parking area, which is in other ownership. And swinging again to the left of that, we look across that parking area towards the double garage associated with the adjoining property, which also has its pedestrian access at the end of that shared access cul-de-sac. Moving on from that, we step into the area next to the application site, and this is us looking down over the shared access towards, as it were, the main enclosed area of the curtilage of Bracklin. So I'll just leave you with that general photograph. Turning first of all in summary to the applicant's case, the existing house is currently let as self-catering holiday accommodation. This proposal is intended to provide separate but ancillary accommodation away from activity in the house, for example, for elderly parents seeking peace and quiet of an evening. The applicant considers that the first reason for refusal is incompetent, as the officer's view that the proposal is, and I quote, tantamount to a new dwelling, end of quotation, is a matter of conjecture. While the site is separated from the house and garden area by the shared access driveway, it is part of the same title and is managed as part of the overall garden area. The accommodation and facilities that would be provided are of very limited nature and hardly that suited to its occupation as a separate dwelling. As ancillary accommodation, there would be no need for a more extensive curtilage, and the restricted size and setting of the building is not seen as having a material effect on the amenity or character of the area. If the proposal was for a house, the development could be argued as being an overdevelopment of the site. However, as ancillary accommodation, it occupies a secluded setting and can be absorbed without loss of visual amenity. If it is used as a separate dwelling, the council could initiate enforcement action. Regarding potential overlooking of the neighbouring property from the balcony level, this could be addressed by erecting screening. Any overlooking only relates to the front garden area and the driveway and not the private rear garden area. In conclusion, for the above reasons, the proposal is seen as being entirely consistent with Local Development Plan Policies RD1, PM1A and PM1C. Turning now in summary to the officer's report of handling, Bracklin is a 4-bedroom detached house enclosed by high hedges and fencing. Access is gained to its driveway via double gates onto the private access, which is shared. The proposed building would be on land on the opposite side of the shared access, which is separate from the enclosed curtilage of the dwelling house. This land has been declared as being part of the garden ground associated with Bracklin. The detached building would have a prominent position, requires groundworks, and is elevated above the adjoining shared access. In the officer's view, to be ancillary, such accommodation would need to be subordinate to the main dwelling and its use supplementary to the existing house. In this instance, the proposed accommodation is entirely separate and fully capable of being functionally independent. She is not convinced by the applicant's submission that there is a justification for a self-contained ancillary building for dependent relatives, or that there is adequate provision for parking and turning. The scale and height of the building and the associated removal of existing trees on what is seen as a cramped and contrived site is viewed as having a detrimental effect on the amenity of the locality and oppressive in relation to its neighbour. It is noted that the building would occupy some 69% of the surrounding site. The site is not considered to be capable of accommodating the development in a satisfactory manner. The elevated balcony and decking area is also seen as raising potential overlooking concerns in relation to the neighbouring property. In conclusion, the proposal is seen as being tantamount to the erection of a separate dwelling with no direct shared facilities with the existing house. Turning to representations, 4 objections have been received. The aspects that relate to the potential planning considerations concern residential amenity and overlooking, visual amenity, land use, loss of trees, the intensity of development, and the degree of self-containment. In this case, there is neither a request for a site visit nor a hearing. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Harrison. I have just one question for you. I think you mentioned in the case officer's points about 69% of the site being developed. Was that just of the bit there in the photograph on the other side of the track? Or
yes.
Was that? Yeah.
Yes, it would be on that side, yes.
Thank you. Any questions for you, Councillor Gray? No. Any questions for you, Councillor Anderson? Right, members, can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of the information before us? That is, the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning officer, or do we require more information? Councillor Gray?
No.
Councillor Anderson?
Happy.
I too am happy to proceed. So we can move to debate. So having considered the applicant's papers, the report of handling, the Perth Kinross Local Development Plan and all other relevant material planning considerations, I will start us off with this one. Colleagues, I have to say that I agree with the reasons for refusal. It seems to me I am not persuaded that this is not in effect a new dwelling. And I'm also not persuaded that it's not overdevelopment of a well-developed area as it is. I'm also perfectly content with the third reason concerning the design, bulk and scale of the proposed building. So I think with that I would say that I am minded to uphold the reasons for refusal. Councillor Gray.
I'm perfectly happy with the paper and the reasons given. Gross overdevelopment of the site in my mind. That's the main point I would wish to make, and happy to go with the paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gray. Councillor Anderson.
Thank you. Yes, it's pretty straightforward here. I do not share the applicant's description of ancillary. I don't think this is an ancillary building. It's overdevelopment. It would be definitely detrimental to neighbouring properties, and it's overdevelopment. So I would agree with both of you to uphold the officer's decision.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Anderson. So, Mr. Fogg, I think on this occasion we are all three of us agreed to uphold the reasons. All 3 reasons of refusal as they are. So that's the decision made. We agree with the refusal. I might add, we don't always agree, so you may see later on, not always such unanimity, but we'll see. Now, we'll move to the next item on the agenda, which is item 4.2, which is erection of a dwelling house in principle on land 40 metres northeast of Flowerdale Farm, Kinross. I can ask if there is anybody, any applicant or agent here for that one? Oh, thank you. Welcome. Welcome. So, Mr. Harrison, can I ask you to introduce this application for review?
Thank you, Convener. As you say, this is a planning application in principle for the erection of a dwelling house at land 40 metres northeast of Flowerdale Farm, Kinross. The site extends to about 0.03 hectares. It comprises a smaller area of hard standing presently occupied by 2 shipping containers and a larger area which forms part of the larger field. The existing farm buildings, former bothy and farmhouse, lie generally to the south and west. Indicative drawings of a house have been included with this in principle application. I must take you to the photographs first, but you might like to have pages 72 onwards, which provides you with a location plan and a site plan. As you see in the first photograph here, the sequence of photographs will be the approaches to the site itself down the private road. The context then in relation to the landscape and the adjoining farm buildings. So I say the first photograph here, as I say, is approaching from the public road up towards the farmsteading, and there'll be more details of that as we go, but it gives you a general indication of the site in relation to the landscape on, as it were, the right-hand side of that photograph, and then moving on from that and swinging round slightly to the left, the site in relation to the opposite side, a part of the larger field. So as it were, moving up the access road from there, we then, from that same position, beg your pardon, we have one more photograph showing you the rest of that field and the adjacent public road. And then moving from there up the access road, we get a little bit closer to the farmhouse in Stendig. This is, of course, the farmhouse, again seen from the private access road. And then swinging slightly to the left of that, we get the main group of farm buildings and, of course, the application site itself. Again, moving up a little bit further up the access road, we then come to, shall we say, where the boundary of the garden ground of the farmhouse is, adjacent to the field. And the next sequence of photographs, again, will all swing towards the left as we move round. So this is part of the farmhouse, and then we have the main farmhouse itself. And then swinging round to the left of that again, from a similar position, we're looking at the main group of farmsteading buildings, and just catching the corner of the application site, part of which is the hard standing. Moving round again to the left of that photograph, we catch the whole of the hard standing. We're picking up the shipping containers now. Swinging round again to the left of that photograph, again the shipping containers, but the main part of the application site. And then swinging round again to the left of that photograph, we catch the remainder of the application site. And finally, swinging round to the left, this is us looking across the remainder of the field back towards the public road. We now, as it were, step into the field to get a view back to see the application site in the context of the buildings, standing in the field here, but then again swinging around to the left, catching the farmhouse in that photograph, and then more fully in that photograph, along with the steading buildings and containers. Swinging round to the left of that photograph, we start to pick up the bothy, which is at the back of the application site, and of course the more modern steading buildings, which will appear in later photographs as well. And then swing round to the right of that, left of that, we then get the remainder of the application site, but we're still seeing the bothy, and beyond that, a sort of Dutch barn. Moving up towards this, more of a detail of the bothy itself. And then moving up a little bit further again from that, and looking back, we see the bothy in the context of the application site and the extension into the field. Then swinging to the left of that photograph, we're catching just the corner of the bothy, but this is the main modern steading building. And again, swinging to the left of that photograph, we pick up the Dutch barn, which was in the earlier one. From there, we then move right to the back of the steading buildings. We're looking back at the back of the whole group of buildings, and we're just catching part of the farmhouse on the left-hand side of the photograph as well. So this is the yard at the back of the steading buildings. And then as we go round the whole steading, we're gradually going back to the application site. We go down that side, and this takes us back to the front of the steading buildings. Swinging round to the left of that, we get the building which backs onto the application site, which we're just beginning to pick up here. And then moving down a little bit down that access road from there, we get the main part of the application site. Swing round to the left of that, the remainder of the application site, as we look back down towards the public road, which you catch with the line of trees there. And this is us down now on that public road now, looking back across the main field to the position of the application site. So I'll just leave you with that general photograph. Turning first of all to the summary of the applicant's case, the buildings at Flowerdale Farm are seen as a building group. It is accepted that the farmhouse and steading are prominent and the site is highly visible from the surrounding area. However, the site is seen as the most appropriate extension to that group, and its selection would minimise the impact of the house on the surrounding landscape and would provide enhanced security. It is seen as involving only a small area of land out of a much larger field, and the proposed house would be seen against the backdrop of the existing buildings. The applicant considers that the assessment that has been undertaken is unfair and concerns have been overstated. It envisages that the proposed house would be positioned in line with the existing buildings and would be of a sympathetic design. Extensive landscaping of the site is also envisaged to assist in its integration. Attention is drawn to the personal circumstances of two families working the farm, where the older generation wishes to effect the transition of the operations to the next generation. The erection of the purpose-built house would also assist one family member who requires to use a wheelchair. Local Development Plan Policy RD6, Particular Needs Housing Accommodation, suggests that such considerations should be taken into account, and this is not referred to in the report of handling. The earlier consent for the use and extension of the existing bothy was for a single farm worker and not a family with accessibility considerations. This arable farming enterprise takes place on 3 locations covering some 210 hectares and is managed through contractors organised and overseen from this location. There is no labour directly employed on the farm, and the house is seen as supporting the long-term process of the transition of the business and reflects the economic activity aspect of the housing in the countryside guidance. Turning now in summary to the officer's report of handling, the application falls to be assessed against Local Development Plan Policy RD3 and the associated Housing in the Countryside guidance, notably in relation to the building group and new houses in the countryside categories. It is accepted that the farmhouse and steading buildings at the farm constitute a farm building group. However, the proposed extension to that group by this proposal is not assessed as meeting the requirements of a, and I quote, definable site formed by existing topography and or well-established landscape features which provide a suitable setting, end of quotation. The site is not seen as having such definition or enclosure on its northwestern and northeastern boundaries onto the adjoining farmland and, consequently, does not meet the building group criteria. While acknowledging that the existing buildings would provide a backdrop, the site is assessed as being highly visible from the surrounding area and the public road. The potential justification for a house in the open countryside in relation to economic activity has also been assessed. The information submitted is viewed as unconvincing in terms of demonstrating an operational need for an additional house on site. While the prospective transition is acknowledged, there is a lack of statistical or factual information demonstrating an operational requirement. Irrespective of that conclusion, the proposal is not seen as meeting the siting criteria, which indicates that the subdivision of a field to create a site for a house would not be acceptable. If the operational need for an additional house at the farm was justified, it is considered that there are other options, such as the conversion of the bothy, which previously enjoyed planning permission. The circumstances and statement of the operation of the farm and the contribution to the local economy have been noted in this assessment. Regarding matters of design, residential amenity, privacy, these are all seen as being capable of being addressed in the event of planning permission being granted. In this case, there are no representations. However, there is a request for a site visit. There is no request for a hearing. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Mr Harrison. Are there any questions for officers on the application for review? Councillor Anderson?
No questions.
Thank you. Councillor Gray? No. I too have no questions, Mr Harrison. So, members, can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of the information before us? That is, the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor, or do we require more information? Councillor Anderson?
Don't require any further information.
Councillor Gray? No, don't. So I am also happy to proceed. So we will move to debate. Can I ask you, Councillor Anderson, having considered the applicant's papers, the report of handling, the Perth Kinross Local Development Plan and all other relevant material planning considerations, to start us off?
Thank you, Convener. Yes, we've had a very good look at this application and consider it, and I feel that I am in support of the officer's decision. Looking at it and looking at the pictures, one can see that there's at least two sides where there's no defined boundaries, and in my view, it's not part of a building group. It's clearly out with that. I agree with the argument for security, but this argument is not strong enough, in my view, to allow consent for this site, and it's contrary to policy RD3 of the Housing in the Countryside Act, so I would uphold the officer's decision.
Thank you very much, Councillor Anderson. Councillor Gray?
I've got to say I'm somewhat concerned that the impression given by the very pictures there and by the report that this is some great intrusion into a field. If you look at the page 74, 75, you can see it is a very small corner which in fact completes a square to some extent in line with the southernmost boundary of the garden, existing garden on the other side of the road. And in line with let's say a natural boundary which bounds the steading area, yard area and the field beyond. It's a small corner, frankly, of a field which squares it for purposes of arable farming. It doesn't really offend it in any way. I can't see that's an important element. Most importantly so is I firmly believe that farms require two dwellings, simple as that. We are warned every week in the farming press of the concerns regarding theft in the countryside, and one house on a farm is simply not enough these days. You simply need two, not only for reasons of security, but for reasons of durability of whoever is there. It should not be a 24/7 job as it was perhaps for farmers from 50 years ago. It shouldn't. It should be a job whereby one person is there for a certain period of time and he can readily call on someone else who is there for the remainder of the time. And that needs to be the same. We will never have succession in farms, and we've lost countless numbers of them if we do not have succession. So I would argue strongly that for employment reasons, we do need another house on this farm, and frankly, I cannot see any other more appropriate area around that farmhouse steading for putting a house. And therefore, I would go against the paper on the basis that it does comply with housing in the countryside. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gray. I did say we didn't always agree, so think on this occasion, although I have a degree of sympathy for the points Councillor Gray has made, I feel that some of the issues raised by the planning officer, particularly concerning other options there may be, and the lack of a definable site here on this site, I am inclined to agree with the officer's recommendation. So that's going to be a 2-1, Mr. Fogg. Okay, thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you. So if we move on now, if we may, to item 4.3, which is change of use of agricultural land to garden ground, erection of stable, store, workshop, garage building, ancillary shelter, and formation of a vehicular access at Robin's Nest, Balathy, Kincleven. Can I ask if the applicant or agent are here today? Oh, thank you, madam. Welcome. So, Mr. Harrison, can I ask you to introduce this paper?
Thank you, Convener. This is a detailed planning application, as you say, for the change of use of agricultural land to garden ground, erection of a stables, store, workshop and garage building, ancillary shelter and formation of vehicular access at Robin's Nest, Balathy, Kincleven. The original garden ground extended to some 950 square metres, to which some 150 square metres has been added as an enlargement as part of the approval of a separate planning application involving the substantial extension of the present cottage. The proposed extension to the garden ground in this case would add a further 1,400 square metres. The stables, store, workshop, garage building would have a footprint of some 180 square metres, and the field shelter, which has been erected, covers 18 square metres. The applicant owns the immediate surrounding field. Now I'll just take you to the photographs now, but you might like to have pages 169 onwards, which will provide you with the location plan and the site plan and drawings of the buildings. The general sequence of the photographs will be the site and its existing access, then the proposed access, then the land affected by the change of use and the siting of the buildings in its landscape context. So say this is the existing access onto the main public road, taking you into the applicant's property. And moving up that access road a little bit, we see where there's some work taking place which is separate from the applicant's land holding on the right-hand side of the photograph, but through the Harris fencing you can probably make out the cottage beyond that. So we go up a little bit further up the road. This is us looking down onto the applicant's property and the existing cottage as it stands. We then move on from that to the proposed access, which is on the far side of the cottage, just to orientate you. And this is us looking at the back of the building now, and the access which will be coming in through an existing field entry. And as we step in there, we start to see some of the surrounding land. So this is land to the rear of the applicant's property, again in its ownership. But the next photographs will take you around towards the left. So we catch the access road leading up to the back of the cottage, as it were, and swing around again to the left. On the other side of the access road, we've got the land generally associated with the existing shelter. You'll have noted as part of this there's a substantial hedge on that boundary. Moving on from there, as it were, up the access road, this is us, of course, getting closer to the property. We see the field shelter that's been erected, and then the caravan on site, and the existing cottage. And the intention, of course, on the plan is to change the field shelter area and to take it into part of the curtilage of the dwelling house. Swinging round to the right of that photograph, we then get the back of the cottage and the area to the rear of the cottage, which will be occupied by the proposed building, which which is shown in this photograph. We're just catching part of the cottage as well. So that's the area of ground which would be taken into part of the curtilage out of the adjoining field. And again, if we swing to the right of that photograph, we're looking back up that adjoining field towards the countryside beyond. Moving on from that photograph, we move into the field, as it were. Just see the existing field shelter and the caravan and the cottage on the right-hand side of the photograph, and of course other development beyond the hedge and the public road beyond the application site as well. So this is the area of land where the principal proposed building would be sited. Swinging round to the right of that photograph, catching the back of the cottage as well, and then moving on from that, as it were, beyond the cottage, we now look back past the gable of the cottage over the area where the proposed extension, which has already been approved, would be undertaken. Swinging round to the right of that photograph, we swing right across the front area of the existing and original garden ground or curtilage associated with the cottage, which is generally shown by the green line. And if we move from there towards where you see some trees have been taken down, we catch the existing, or I should say the original garden ground boundary shown in green there, and beyond that the additional area or proposed garden area envisaged on that side of the cottage. So if we swing slightly to the right of that photograph, we look over that area beyond the paddock towards the hedge I mentioned earlier. And again, if we swing to the right of that photograph, we're looking across the remainder of the field, again associated with the cottage, towards Bluebell Cottage. So I'll just leave you with that general photograph to give you an indication of the principal part of the site. Turning first of all in summary to the applicant's case, planning permission was granted for the erection of an extension to the existing cottage and an enlargement of the original garden onto the adjoining field in January 2019. It was anticipated that permission would be granted for this associated application, which was not determined until March 2019. The delay has caused difficulties for the applicant, who is required to close the existing access within this month. The proposed buildings are seen as essential to support this rural property and its domestic requirements. The timber stables, workshop and garaging building and the field shelter are of typical rural materials and design, and generally screened by vegetation from the adjoining public roads some 90 and 160 metres away. They are seen as making a positive contribution to the landscape. The large scale of the proposed building relative to the existing cottage is identified as the sole area of concern for the planning officer. The officer considers that it would be acceptable relative to the approved extension had it already been undertaken. The applicant intends to carry out all of the proposed development together, with the ancillary building being used for storage purposes during the development process. The low-level buildings are seen as being of an appropriate scale, especially when compared with other large farm buildings beside public roads and set close to houses in this locality. And reference here is made to Wood End and Balathy farms. The proposal is seen as complying with local development plan policies PM1A and PM1B. Turning now in summary to the officer's report of handling. The officer has no concerns regarding the enlargement of the garden ground or the field shelter. The proposed stables, workshop, garage building is seen as having an adverse impact on the visual amenity of the area and excessively large relative to the small cottage. As there is no certainty that the approved extension will be undertaken, it is seen as appropriate for this proposal to be assessed on the basis of the current situation. The footprint of the stable, workshop, garage building is greater than the existing cottage and is of a scale more akin to a commercial activity rather than ancillary to the cottage as a domestic building. The site is very open, and while set behind the roadside hedge, there is little landscaping around the application site. The officer is not convinced that the development would take and would make a positive contribution to its surroundings. The proposed provision of a 6.5 metre wide access roadway is also seen as having an impact on visual amenity. In conclusion, the proposal is viewed as being contrary to local development plan policies PM1A and PM1B Part C due to the visual impact. Turning to representations, one representation has been received expressing concern about the large scale of the proposed building, particularly relative to the cottage, and the effect on the character of the area, and also in relation to the proposed access regarding its width. In this case, there is neither a request for a site visit nor a hearing. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Harrison. Are there any questions for officers on the application for review? Councillor Gray.
Yes, could I ask why the need to close the existing access?
My understanding is, shall we say, a civil matter with the applicant having purchased the site, that it's been, shall we say, a requirement of that purchase that the existing access is closed. The details of it I'm not aware of, but I understand that's basically the requirement to close the existing access.
That you, Councillor Gray? Councillor Anderson, any questions for you?
Yes, I don't know if you can answer it, this, but is there any reason why the cottage and this application for ancillary buildings, Stables Workshop, etc., couldn't have been put in as one rather than having this one following on from the first one?
We say it's following on. I understand they were put in at similar times, but I'm not sure. I have no reason, I can't explain the reason why they might have been made as independent applications. The applicant is perfectly entitled to make separate applications. I'm not aware of any reason why that has happened in this particular instance.
Thank you.
I have no questions of officers. So, members, can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of the information before us, that is, the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor, or do we require more information? Councillor Gray.
Proceed.
Councillor Anderson.
Looking at the pictures up here and reading this, I feel that there maybe is a need for a site visit on this particular one, to get a true feel for exactly what's going on up there.
Thank you very much, Councillor Anderson. We work on the basis if a site visit is required, we will stop now and arrange a site visit and revisit this application later. Happy with that, Mr. Fogg? Right, so the next application is a planning application for the erection of a wind turbine and ancillary equipment, Aviva headquarters, Peteville, Perth. Can I ask if there is any applicant or agent here for that one? No. Okay. Mr. Harrison, can I ask you to introduce this application for review?
Thank you, Convener. As you say, this is a detailed application for the erection of a wind turbine and ancillary equipment at Aviva headquarters, Peteville, Perth. The application site is located at the eastern end of the main car park at a level of the surrounding ground area of 91 AOD. It would be some 77 metres to blade tip, 55 metres to hub level, with a blade diameter of some 44 metres. It would be some 40 metres from the Aviva building and some 50 metres from the former sports centre. The generating capacity would be between 800 and 900 kilowatts. A transformer kiosk and associated engineering works would also form part of the proposal. And you might like to have page 573 onwards, which will provide you with a location plan and a site plan and drawings of the turbine. But you also might like to, as it were, have page 600 onwards, which provide you with the viewpoints which relate to the critical matter under consideration. In this case, as you can see from the blank screen, I don't intend to show any photographs because you have that formal photographic information in front of you. So turning immediately to the applicant's case in summary, the papers relating to this application are extensive. The following summary focuses on the planning statement only. The applicant aspires to reach 100% renewable energy source generation as an international exemplar. A wind turbine of this capacity is seen as the only means towards achieving this aim by providing some 50% of the electricity required. The proposal seeks to respond to climate change, carbon emissions, and renewable energy targets. The overall investment, including grant assistance from Scottish Government, would be some £3 million. A more decentralised and urban siting for a wind turbine is seen as desirable in this context. The applicant's response to the local development plan considerations may be summarised as follows. Under policy ER1A, renewable and low carbon energy, which offers broad support for such development, the proposal is seen as complying with criteria A. The landscape and visual impact assessment predicts that, firstly, the adverse impacts at close to medium range on the urban and lowland hills character types would be of moderate to minor scale, more often minor at long range, and not likely to be significant overall. Secondly, at close range on the M90 and core paths, Craigie Hill Golf Course and Canoe Hill, at close and moderate range, the effects would be moderate or minor and not likely to be significant overall. And thirdly, there would be no likely significant effects on the Sidlaw Hills and Ochil Hills special landscape areas. It's considered that the Council and SNH have not demonstrated how they have arrived at the contrary assessment that there would be significant detrimental impact, notably when the mitigating effects of woodland and visual barriers are taken into account. The site is separated from the adjoining M90 corridor by woodland, and the nearest houses are some 350 metres away. This locality contains modern housing of different styles and forms, offices and motorway services. There are pylons some 1.2 kilometres to the southwest and telecommunication masts on Mailer Hill and St Magdalene's Hill. It is concluded that while the turbines would be clearly visible from a small number of localised visual receptors, no significant effects on visual amenity are predicted, and the proposal is seen as according with local development plan policies ERA 1A and ED1A. The applicant considers that wind turbines are viewed by many as modern works of kinetic art and symbolic of sustainable futures. Under policy HE2 listed buildings, the potential effect on the setting of the adjoining Category A listed building is acknowledged. The applicant concurs with Historic Environment Scotland's view that there is a moderate significant impact on this listed building. While this could be reduced by relocating the turbine, this cannot be achieved within the applicant's landholding while maintaining separation distances with housing and the M90. However, these impacts are seen as acceptable when balanced against the benefits secured from the development. Views out from the building and the building itself would not be directly affected. The brutalist concrete style of the building its detailing and stepped forms are seen as being more capable of accommodating the turbine within its setting. The turbine is also seen as enabling development as a means of retaining the listed building and its present use. Turning now to policy EP8, noise pollution, the applicant's noise impact assessment concludes that there would be no detrimental impact on residential amenity, and the proposal therefore complies with this policy. This conclusion has not been disputed by Environmental Health, who seek further background information. Policy EP8 does not refer to shadow flicker. In the worst case, some 191 properties could potentially and technically be affected. In practice, only the Aviva building and the adjacent sports centre are expected to be affected. Such effects could be mitigated through a planning condition requiring the installation of an electronic controller to pause the rotor automatically. Under policy ED1A, employment and mixed-use areas, the Council seems to accept that all aspects of this policy are met with the exception of Part A, concerning residential amenity. There are many wind energy schemes in close proximity to housing. While this would be a large and prominent structure when viewed in close proximity, it is not seen as overbearing or dominant due to the separation distance to housing and existing trees. The economic and environmental benefits of the proposal are seen as outweighing the adverse impacts, while, like most EAI developments, the proposal identifies some significant environmental impacts. It does not follow that the impact of the proposal as a whole is significant. Additionally, and separately, a community trust fund is also envisaged, which would provide a minimum of £5,000 per annum to local organisations and charities. Turning now to the summary of the Officer's Report of Handling, the broad policy support from Scottish and UK Government for proposals that reduce greenhouse gas emissions is recognised, and this is reflected in TAPLAN Policy 7 and Local Development Plan Policy ER1. Support within the Local Development Plan Policy is dependent upon the proposal fulfilling a number of criteria. In essence, the Planning Officer considers that the proposal is contrary to ER1A, Criteria A, due to the aspects of, firstly, the potential impact on landscape character, secondly, visual integrity, thirdly, the historic environment, fourthly, cultural heritage, and fifthly, residential amenity. Also, the site is part of an area identified as economic land covered by Local Development Plan Policy ED1A, which seeks to retain employment. Criteria A of that policy states that, and I quote, proposals should not detract from the amenity of adjoining, especially residential areas, end of quotation. Again, the Planning Officer considers that the proposal is contrary to that policy and criteria. It is also noted that the M90 and the Perth Greenbelt lie to the south. Turning specific to landscape and visual impact concerns, the applicant's environmental impact assessment, zones of theoretical visibility study, and the associated photomontages and resultant assessment regarding the potential visual impact have been considered. It is noted these assessments conclude that the proposed turbine would have no overall significant effect on the rural landscape or urban area of Perth. Although the turbine would be clearly visible from a small number of localised receptors, the applicant's assessment predicts no significant effect on visual amenity. The Planning Officer does not concur with this conclusion. The Officer and Scottish Natural Heritage share the view that the assessment underplays the impact of the turbine in the landscape and the surrounding area, and consider that there would be significant landscape and visual effects on residents and visitors to Perth from within the city and from the major tourist routes passing the city. The visualizations are seen as demonstrating that the turbine would appear as an uncharacteristic and prominent feature when open to view. It is anticipated that the turbine would become the most visible tall structure on the edge of the, and I put in inverted commas, bowl containing the city. In addition, the moving blades are expected to exacerbate the impact by drawing the viewer's eye to this prominent feature. The applicant's assessment states that within 500 metres, and then I quote, the turbine would be fully screened from the majority of Perth urban area, end of quotation. This is not seen as capturing the repeated open, unrestricted views of the turbine by residents and visitors as they move around the city. Considering the turbine's elevated position, the large number of residents and visitors within a 5-kilometre radius, and the number of people passing on major routes, that's the A9, the A90 and the M90, the applicant's assessment that there is no significant landscape and visual effects is simply not accepted by the officer. Consequently, the proposal is seen as being contrary to Local Development Plan Policy ER1A due to significant detrimental impact on landscape character, visual integrity, the historic environment, cultural heritage and residential amenity. Turning now to cultural heritage, the Aviva building is listed Category A. The EIA acknowledges that the turbine would be a prominent feature which would disrupt the architectural composition between what is described as the, inverted commas, ground scraping, close inverted commas, building, the terraced hillside and trees. The officer considers that it would break the skyline, be distracting and compete visually with the listed building. Attention is drawn to the description of the building when it was listed, and that's on page 2017, in 2019. This description is set out on page 1227. This emphasises the importance of the relationship between the listed building and its setting being integral to its architectural and historic interest. In this context, a 77-metre high turbine, combined with the movement of its blades in such close proximity, is viewed as having a significant detrimental impact on that setting. This is not seen as being outweighed by the improvement in the energy source for the building. Historic Environment Scotland has objected to the proposal because it raises issues of national interest for this important heritage asset, notably the impact on the close range views as illustrated by viewpoints 1 and 5. The turbine is expected to become the dominant element in this locality, disrupting the overall composition and redefining its focus. In concurring with these views, the officer concludes that the proposal would be contrary to Local Development Plan Policy HE2 regarding listed buildings and the relevant part of Scottish Planning Policy, that is paragraph 141. Additionally, the proposal is seen as having a detrimental impact on the setting of Pitheathlis Castle, a Category A listed building, and Pitheathlis Cottages, Category B listed buildings. In conclusion, the prospective economic and environmental benefits of the proposal in generating renewable energy are not considered to outweigh the adverse impacts which are viewed as significant. Most notably, the proposal is considered to be contrary to Local Development Plan Policies ER1A and HE2 and ED1A and potentially EP8. In this case, I should say there are 5 objections, mainly concerning adverse impact on visual amenity and the character of the area, the inappropriate nature of the land use, noise and safety concerns. There are also 7 letters of support, and these have been received. Moving on from that, regarding matters of procedure, the applicant invites the local review body to request, firstly, further information in relation to noise and shadow flicker to respond to the views of the Environmental Health Officer, and secondly, further information on the economic and environmental importance of the proposal and the scale of investment involved. This information might be provided either through a hearing or by written submissions. In this case, the applicant has requested a site visit. Although they've requested a hearing in that context, there is no formal request for a hearing in the original Notice of Review papers. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Harrison. Are there any questions for officers on the application for review? Councillor Gray.
Yes, thank you. Regarding that last point from Mr Harrison, I requested further information. He suggests that we request further information on noise. Is this correct?
Yes, they're inviting you to request that there is an opportunity for the Environmental Health Officer to respond because one of the reasons for refusal is the lack of information, and they're inviting you that if you wish to, you could ask them to provide that information at this stage so that you have that in front of you, should you consider that necessary.
Could I ask for Mr Fogg the procedure to do this?
Well, you have a choice, Councillor Gray, to ask for additional information preparatory to a hearing or simply as written submissions to address the point. It would be deferred pending receipt of that further information if you so resolved.
I've got to say that would be my preference, is to defer to have this information. It was a patent blank in the information we have received so far. There was mitigation measures suggested for the flicker, but not for the noise, and therefore I feel it's an essential element of it. And therefore I would seek deferment for that reason.
Just to be clear, that's further information in relation to the mitigation of the noise impact and to better understand shadow flicker and assess it.
If that can be provided as well, fine, yeah. Regarding the electronic shut-off mechanism. But the noise one was the key, which was not covered.
Mr Full, would it be appropriate to see if to have a comment from myself and Councillor Anderson, or is it like as with site visits we defer to this request?
I know the convention is that if I think the rationale was if one member felt that there was insufficient information, it was perhaps unsatisfactory to, by majority, compel that member to participate in determining it nonetheless. Councillor Graham might be aware, I think, that the planning officer was aware that the information in her view was lacking in that respect, but given the view she had taken on the landscape impact assessment and other matters, I think her position, I'm surmising, was that it was could be viewed as unnecessary expenditure for the applicant to incur, because irrespective of the noise, it wasn't going to answer the concerns, fundamental concerns she had, shared by HES about that aspect, and that's why she hadn't done it. But you are free to take a different view in the matter, what the committee is. I don't know if that answers your question.
I'm quite happy with that, so I think we will go and have this. It does seem to me, in 1,000 pages, you can't provide us with enough information, but I think we do need to seek further information to be absolutely sure on this. So I agree, and I think Councillor Anderson agrees with Councillor Gray on this.
I would concur with that. Yes, we need to get that sorted out.
Yeah, I suppose the one question I arises in my mind, convener, and it is again entirely up to yourselves. I appreciate this is a site in a locality with which this membership today, and likely any other membership of the LRB, will be thoroughly familiar. But since you're deferring in any event, would you wish to take the opportunity for a site visit, or do you feel the visualisations that have been permitted and your knowledge is sufficient that that's unnecessary?
Certainly for myself, I wouldn't require a site visit, but I wouldn't, but I don't know what Councillor Anderson and Councillor Gray think. Well, I think we all are agreed we're familiar with the site. It's just this particular aspect is missing, and we want to have that filled in. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Moving on, colleagues, to item 4.5, says erection of a dwelling house in principle, land 70 metres southwest of Bonington View, Bonington Road, Rattray. Can I ask if there is any applicant or agent here for this site? Oh, welcome, welcome. Mr. Harrison, can I ask you to take us through this application?
Thank you, Convener. This is a planning application in principle for the erection of a dwelling house at land 70 metres southwest of Bonington View, Bonington Road, Rattray. The application site, minus the access, extends to approximately 1,500 square metres of a larger field which lies towards the east. There is a belt of trees towards the western boundary and detached houses, including the applicant's current property, towards the north, and a house on the southern boundary. Access would be taken from Bonington Road through the field, which is in the applicant's ownership. You might like to have page 1315 available, provide you with a location plan and site plan. The general sequence of the photographs, which I'll show, are the access, the adjoining houses, the site, and the remainder of the field, and some additional adjoining land. So this is the first photographs as it were, Bonington Road, going up Bonington Road towards the entry into the application site, which would be on the left-hand side of the road as we're looking at it in the photograph here, just before the driveway you can probably just about make out there, which is also on the left-hand side of the photograph. So if we move up that road a little bit, we get to that entry which serves the two existing houses, the applicant's house, which is Bonington View, and its neighbour. Moving into that, we see the frontage of the applicant's existing house, and then the access point from Bonington Road that I mentioned earlier into the field. So if we step into the field, as it were, from there, we're now looking back up to a slightly higher level where Bonington Road is, where it would come in to the field at that point, and then as we swing round to the right of that, we look across the remainder of the field, the dotted line showing the settlement boundary, which of course is referred to in the papers. Then moving round to the right of that photograph again, still from that same position on the access road, we're looking down the field and the part of the application site which abuts Burnside Cottage. And swinging round to the right of that again, we're looking across the remainder of the application site as you approach it from the access road, and you'll see the landscaping on that far boundary. Moving round to the right of that again, we see, as it were, the corner of the application site, and of course the adjoining property we saw a little bit earlier, Ambrose. And swinging around again to the right of that, we're looking over the boundary, as it were, towards Bonington View again. So moving on from that, stepping down, looking down the body of the application site, and this shows you the site boundary with the field, and of course Burnside Cottage at the far end of the application site. Moving, as it were, into the field, we're now looking back with Burnside Cottage now on the left-hand side of the photograph. We're looking across the remainder of the field towards the application site. And then swinging round to the right of that, we catch as it were, effectively the whole of the application site and just the gable of Ambrose. And then if we step from there as it were, slightly higher level up onto Bonington Road itself. Again, we're getting the whole application site. Swinging round from that, we, as it were, look over the other side of Bonington Road, the eastern side, as it were, into some development and the fields on that side of the road. And swinging round slightly to the right of that side of the road, we see the remainder of the field directly opposite. So I'll just leave you that general photograph. Turning first in summary to the applicant's case, the current local development plan identifies the whole of the application site as lying within the countryside and disconnected from the town by the adjoining property, that's Burnside House. It is seen as inaccurate for it to be described as being located, and I quote, located immediately out with the defined settlement boundary, close quotations, in the officer's report of handling. The land is seen as a gap site due to the proximity of the existing buildings. This proposal is different from the earlier planning application site, the access road of which was onto Hatton Road, connected with the settlement boundary. The proposed access for this proposal is onto Bonington Road. Consequently, it is considered that this proposal should only be assessed as a gap site under Local Development Plan Policy RD3, housing in the countryside. The gap is some 60 metres wide, which is viewed as being within the parameters of this policy. This distance is also seen as insignificant to provide a visual gap. Further planting could be required by a planning condition to enhance the settlement boundary at this location. The proposal is not viewed as creating an extension to or sprawl from the settlement boundary, but would form development of a compact and nucleated shape. The site is seen as being surrounded by a variety of other existing and proposed forms of development, including a prospective housing site in Local Development Plan 2 and within a building group formed by the adjoining houses. The development is seen as respecting the amenity, character, layout and pattern of the group, and for which a suitably designed house with landscaping could be accommodated. In conclusion, the proposal is viewed as according with the relevant parts of Local Development Plan Policies PM1A, PM1B and RD3. Attention is drawn to the physical, medical problems and local family connections of the applicant. Her existing house, Bonington View, is seen as having limited scope for adaptation, and the intention is to build a suitably designed house for her needs. Turning now to the officer's report of handling in summary, the application site is large enough to accommodate a house of a suitable design and satisfactory access without adverse effects on residential amenity. As the application site lies within the landward area, where such proposals are normally assessed against Local Development Plan Policy RD3, housing in the countryside, in this instance, the officer considers that it is crucial for the proposal to be assessed against Local Development Plan Policy PM4, settlement boundaries, due to its location immediately adjacent to the Blairgowrie and Rattray settlement boundary. This policy was specifically added to the Local Development Plan by the Government Reporter to establish a presumption against development out with defined settlement boundaries. Approval of such proposals would undermine the purpose of this policy, which seeks to avoid piecemeal development on the edge of settlements. In this context, the proposal is assessed as being contrary to Local Development Plan Policy PM4. The site is also seen as providing a visual gap between the building group on Bonington Road and the settlement. There is no definable boundary along the southwestern boundary of the application site. The development would result in the coalescence of that group with the settlement and raises the prospect of proposals for the further development of the remainder of the field in due course. This is viewed as a form of urban sprawl into the countryside beyond the settlement boundary. In this case, there are no representations. There is a request for a site visit, but no request for a hearing. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Harrison. Are there any questions for officers on the application for review? Councillor Anderson? No. Councillor Gray?
Perhaps I missed it, but how long has Bonington View been in existence? Do we know?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I think
I do ask because the outline is very rather similar to that of the proposed house. Which would suggest it's of a modern design.
I can't give you an exact date for that, I'm afraid.
Okay, sorry. No. Anyway, no further.
Thank you, Councillor Gray. I just had one question relating to the need to have an adapted house. Had we any further information from the applicant about how the Bonington View could not be adapted, given it seems to be a relatively modern house?
There's no detail within the papers beyond what you have. In short, no, I've no further information on that at all, no.
Thank you, Mr Harrison. So, members, can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of information before us, that is, the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor, or do we require more information? Councillor Anderson?
Happy to proceed.
Councillor Gray?
Yes, happy to proceed.
I too am happy to proceed. So, we'll move to debate. Can I ask you, Councillor Anderson, having considered the applicant's papers, the report of handling, Perth Kinross local development plan and all other relevant material planning considerations to start us off?
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Yes, again, I've looked at this in detail, and normally one would think this is an infill, but we have the issue of the settlement boundary which comes into play here. And considering this, I would have to back the officers in the refusal of this, because it does seem that it is an issue of settlement boundaries, and therefore I'd uphold officer on this occasion.
Thank you very much, Councillor Anderson. Councillor Gray?
Yes, I must concur. I see this as, yes, on the face of it, is an infill site, but it unfortunately is an infill site which, in fact, creates another arguably part of a unit in another infill site, so it would be, and it would completely make a mockery of the village or community boundary along Hatton Road. And I think it would be a very dangerous precedent to go ahead with this.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Gray. I agree with you both. I have to say, I think this would be the start of urban sprawl, and we have a duty to uphold these boundaries. So I think that's a unanimous decision, Mr Fogg, that we uphold the reasons for refusal. Okay, thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you. Right, colleagues, we move on now to the two deferred applications, and this is item 5.1, which is a planning application, a change of use of office to dwelling house, erection of 2 units class 4, erection of 7 dwelling houses, 8 flats and associated works, land 60 metres north of Burnside Joiners, Home Street, Aberfeldy. Can I ask if there are anybody here from this application? Oh, welcome. Mr Harrison, can I ask you to introduce his application for review?
Thank you, Convener. As you say, there's a detailed planning application for the change of use of office to dwelling house, erection of 2 units, class 4, erection of 7 dwelling houses, 8 flats and associated works at land 60 metres north of Burnside Joiners, Home Street, Aberfeldy. The site was formerly occupied by Fisher's Laundry, a business that has moved to a new location. The house was used as an office for that business. Housing lies to the south and west. Aberfeldy Business Park lies to the east and playing fields to the north. The site lies within the Aberfeldy Conservation Area and is identified as existing employment land in the current local development plan. I'll take you through the photographs just to refresh your memory following the site visit, but you might like to have page 1377 onwards, which provides you with the location plan and site plan and drawings of the proposal. So this, as I'm sure you will recall, is the frontage onto Home Street. And if we go up Home Street a little bit and look back, again we see the white building which provides the frontage there, and we're just beginning to pick up the frontage of the adjoining property which was used as the office, which is this property, Parkside House. If we go from there, as it were, into the application site proper, this is now looking at the adjoining buildings with that access which serves those buildings on that southern side of the application site. And from a similar position swinging towards the left, we look down that boundary with the main, as it were, white building on the left-hand side of the photograph, but we're also picking up some of the other ancillary buildings further on and beyond the trees, and beside the trees we have the industrial site itself. So if we move towards the left of that, catching some of the back of the house and some of the tanks and part of the original building. Moving on from that, we now move further down that boundary and looking into the southeastern corner of the site. We're just picking up one of the ancillary buildings there as well on the left-hand side of the photograph. So we swing slightly to the left there, we catch the 2 existing buildings within the application site which are envisaged as being retained. Moving on from that, we catch those same buildings but further back, as it were, into that little recess within the application site. And then if we swing to the left of that photograph, we look across the main body of the application site and of course the principal building. Moving on from that again, we're now looking at the, shall we say, the adjoining industrial area, an adjoining building that's there. The yellow line showing the general position of one of the proposed additional industrial units envisaged. Then if we swing to the left of that photograph, we catch the row of trees which we saw on the site on that northeastern boundary. Moving further on from that, as it were, past the trees, we catch the other building on that northern boundary which is intended to be retained. And swinging slightly to the left of that, we look up the existing access road, which is also seen as the prospective proposed access road to serve both the housing and the industrial area which would be retained. And as we go up that road, as it were, we now look back towards the building, the industrial building is going to be retained on that northern boundary. And stepping further back again from that, we are still on the access road looking down the full length of it on that northern boundary. So I'll just leave you that general photograph of the main building. Turning first of all in summary to the applicant's case, this is a summary of the statement submitted with the notice of review. It does not seek to summarise all the extensive associated papers before the LRB. Regarding reason 1, it's considered that the reference in the decision notice to policy EP2, employment, was unintended and should read policy ED1, employment and mixed use areas. The following statement is based on that assumption. The purpose of the policy is to retain land for employment purposes. the applicant does not consider that there is a sufficient demand for such land to support the retention of the entire site for employment purposes, especially for a single user. The proposal would enable some 50% of the site area to be developed for housing, thereby enabling the refurbishment of existing and the erection of more suitable small industrial units to be commercially viable. The smaller units are assessed as being capable of providing an equivalent number of jobs on the site when compared with the former use. This is the basis of the applicant's submission to Local Development Plan 2, which seeks the reallocation of the site to come under Policy 7B Mixed Use Area rather than Part A, which would reserve the complete site for industrial purposes only. The Council has recognised that this might be appropriate, subject to a number of conditions. In its submission for the examination of LDP2, granting planning permission at this time is not seen as compromising the considerations of the examination of the incoming local development plan, and reflects the position of third parties that have made submissions on this aspect of LDP2. In these circumstances, it is not seen as necessary to await the outcome of the examination into the local development plan, as the proposal is seen as being in conformity with the provision of the proposed plan. If permission is not granted, it is anticipated that the site would remain vacant. No offers were forthcoming for the use of the site for industrial or commercial purposes when the site was marketed. The applicant envisages that the existing industrial units would be refurbished before the occupation of the first house, with the new units being built before the occupation of the last house. Regarding reason 2, it is considered that the hours of operation and noisy operations outside the industrial units can be controlled by a planning condition. Potential noise impact in the evening and at night, including during times of road gritting operations when windows are expected to be closed, is assessed as being within acceptable limits with no significant risk of sleep disturbance or loss of amenity. Regarding reason 3, in response to the flooding officer's consultation response, an updated statement regarding flood risk has been submitted with the review application. The model has been rerun using the Council's figures. This shows the proposed housing area being out with the functional floodplain. Based on Scottish planning policy and SEPA's guidance, it is considered that the potential risk of flooding within the remaining area is acceptable, as this would be within an industrial/commercial land use. In conclusion, the proposal is considered to fully and reasonably be justified against the provisions of the local development plan. Turning now in summary of the Officer's report of handling, the site is designated as an existing employment area in the current local development plan. Part A of Policy ED1 requires such land to be retained for such use. Therefore, the residential part of this proposal is contrary to the local development plan. Loss of such a large proportion of the site to housing is seen as undesirable, as this is part of the only significant industrial estate in Aberfeldy. The proposed LDP2 is currently with Scottish ministers for examination. This envisages that employment land will be divided between core and general business and industrial areas. Core areas would be reserved for Class 4, 5 and 6 uses. In general areas, there may be potential for a wider mix of uses. Regarding LDP2, Aberfeldy Business Park is seen as important in providing opportunities for economic growth and is identified as a core area under Policy 7A. In responding to the applicant's request for the site to be a general area, the Council recognised that the viability of the whole site being redeveloped for an employment use was marginal at best, and that there was merit in considering the mixed use if residential units could cross-subsidise the delivery of small business units. The Council is not proposing the modification from a core to general designation, but if the reporter is minded to make such a change, it is requested that this be subject to a number of developer requirements. In this context, granting planning permission for this proposal would preempt the consideration of this potential modification through the examination process. The reporter may conclude that the site should be designated as a core area rather than a general mixed-use area. In such circumstances, the granting of planning permission would be contrary to the current and prospective local development plans. Consequently, at this time, the proposal is seen as premature to the outcome of the examination. Consideration through the local development plan process, rather than through a planning application, is seen as the appropriate approach to the future of the site. Setting aside the principle of residential development and regarding the housing itself, the proposed layout, density, scale, design, daylight and sunlight requirements and materials, with the exception of the roof being clad in concrete tile rather than natural slate to accord with this location within the conservation area, are seen as acceptable and complying with Local Development Plan Policy HE3A. The design and position of the industrial units is also seen as acceptable. Regarding the noise impact assessment, Environmental Health is not content with the methodology used and the lack of information during certain periods and circumstances, for example, at night time and with the windows closed. The assessment is not seen as demonstrating that the industrial estate will not adversely impact on the residential amenity of future occupants. Regarding flood risk, the Council is currently carrying out a flood protection study for Aberfeldy. The applicant's flood risk assessment used design flows lower than the Council study. A rerun of the applicant's model using the Council's design flows is seen as necessary. The siting of some of the industrial buildings within the functional floodplain is not seen as being acceptable. The proposal does not include information on how the affordable housing requirement will be delivered. The Council would seek 3 units on site and the remainder through a commuted sum. There are ongoing discussions with the applicant on this aspect. It is noted that the marketing exercise submitted by the applicant concluded that there was no other developer interest in the site, and it was unlikely that a single user would be found for the whole site. Dividing the building into smaller units was also seen as unviable. However, the economic benefits are not considered to outweigh the reasons for refusal. In this case, in relation to representations, there are 5 representations, including Aberfeldy Community Council, all of which support the proposal for mixed development of the site and the provision of smaller scale housing and business space. I would draw your attention to the further information that has been submitted since the first consideration of this case, and this is found on page 1773 onwards, and this is in relation to additional submissions updating the position regarding the flooding matters. In this case, there was a request for a site visit which clearly has been undertaken. There is no request for a hearing. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Harrison. Are there any questions for officers on the application for review? Councillor Gray.
Could I simply ask Mr Fogg again, in view of this not complying with this, or the we do not know of the awaited Local Development Plan 2, in view of non-compliance, are we at liberty to improve?
Well, a planning authority is always free to approve application contrary to development plan. It's necessary in those circumstances to give the reasons why the development plan is being departed from. Established case law says that the primary consideration is the development plan, and there's a presumption in favour of the plan prevailing in terms of the determination, but a plan can always be departed from on cause shown.
Is that you, Councillor Gray? Yep. Councillor Anderson, any questions from you?
Yes, I was up at the site visit, obviously, and I was under the impression that the access road at the corner here was also would be also the access road into industrial units. But looking at page 1729, the visual proposed aerial view, I don't see the roads actually going that far forward. Is that just because you're concentrating on the residential area, or is this actually a plan that would mean the industrial units would be getting access from a different, or have I got it totally wrong?
I don't think you've necessarily got it, as it were, totally wrong. As the title of this says, it's a visualisation and an aerial view as such. I think what in this particular visualisation is obscured, shall we say, the tree and the building may be obscure, and the shadow associated it, because the shadow from southerly direction actually shadows over what I think is, maybe we can make out, is the road, as it were, continuing beyond the group of houses, past the parking area at the back and round into the industrial area. And it might be maybe more useful to look at the formal plan of the site itself on page, if you look on page 1377, you'll see that it says business park access and parking, and you see there's a continuation from the turning area opposite the existing unit, which will be being retained on that northern boundary. So basically the access road, which you saw when you were on site, is intended to continue through, as effectively it does at present, past that industrial unit, as it were, round the corner, past the parking at the back of the proposed housing, into where the units are.
Yes.
So there is only one access envisaged in this plan. I appreciate there are other means of entry, or would appear to be other means of entry to the site from other positions, but the actual plan you have would show it carrying through.
Thank you for that clarity. Yes, it clearly in 1377, it was just when I saw that other one, I just wondered if there'd been perhaps a change.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Anderson. I have no questions myself, colleagues, so I think we'll, can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of the information before us? That is, the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor, or do we require more information? Councillor Anderson.
Happy to proceed.
Councillor Gray? I too am happy to proceed, and we'll move to debate. Having considered the applicant's papers, the report of handling, the Perth Kinross Local Development Plan and all other relevant material planning considerations, I will start things off. Well, colleagues, whilst I can see the reason behind wishing to apply for this type of development here, I feel it's unfortunate timing, given that the examination process is nearing an end, though we're not exactly quite sure when, and that I think that this application is premature, given the fact that we will have clarity from LDP2 very soon. So I would want to change one or two little items and discount the third reason as that for refusal, as that has been covered. But I think, given the fact that LDP2 is on its way, I would be minded to agree with one or two wee revisions, the reasons 1 and 2, colleagues. Councillor Gray.
We don't always agree. I'd just like to say that I cannot see this ever being a complete industrial site again. The access to it has always been down Home Street, which generally speaking a residential street. Industry tends to stop roughly in line with exactly as proposed, and is accessed from a different street altogether. Residential houses all round about, what looks like affordable market houses being proposed, occupation, industrial siting of small units nearby, again, as suggested in a previous application elsewhere, an ideal sort of site. An ideal scenario where we have employment land adjacent to housing land, presenting opportunities not common these days. And I would be happy to stick my neck out and give this one a nod.
Thank you, Councillor Gray. Councillor Anderson.
Yes, this is making it very awkward for me because I'm very much split on this one. I do have sympathy with the applicant and probably people of Aberfeldy that want to see this resolved and see something happening with this redundant site. In real terms, it's never going to be completely industrial. There'll have to be, I cannot see there being any way forward, but for a reasonable amount of the land being used for residential mixed use. So therefore, I will go along with Councillor Gray this time and agree that the appeal should be successful, and they're quite happy to go ahead with it. I do have concerns about the traffic element going through residential houses, even though it already does that, going through residential houses to get to industrial units. But I'm sure that'll be taken on board and some sort of traffic control maybe looked at.
Thank you, Councillor Anderson. So that's a democracy in action. So that's a 2-1, Mr. Fogg. Do we need to elucidate?
I'm assuming it would be a conditioned consent, and it might be appropriate to have both parties comment on conditions, or at least the appointed officer, because you don't have that. I mean, it's likely to be contaminated land. If there's to be residential, I'm sure it would be appropriate to have a desktop study in relation to land contamination. But a number of other matters, I think some careful reflection on the appropriateness of conditions here would be in order. It's convention to delegate that to myself and Mr. Harrison, but in the event that we sought additional guidance, we would bring it back, I think, to yourselves. I don't know, I haven't had a chance to discuss that aspect of this application with Mr. Harrison. I don't know what his further input might be.
Mr. Harrison.
Well, as a matter of routine, as you know, I make a list of prospective conditions in the event of you deciding to grant permission. The first thing I would mention is, of course, an affordable housing element to this. So there would be a requirement for the payment of the appropriate sum associated with that, as well as there seemed to be some discussion as to the affordable housing within the site as well, so that there seemed to be an issue there which would need to be resolved before consent itself in terms of the paperwork was issued. As Mr. Mr. Fogg has said that there is a land contamination study would be a requirement. There may be further details required in relation to noise attenuation, which of course you touched on, to see whether or not that can or cannot reasonably be handled by way of a condition. There's also been reference to a standing building survey being desirable. You may remember when you were on site, we noticed one or two, shall we say, the potential historic aspects of it being a drill hole referred to by the one of the consultees. The question of landscaping is outstanding, as is the issue of tree protection. You also may also have some clarity required in relation to the relationship between the industrial buildings being brought into use in terms of the sequencing and timing in relation to the houses, so that there are quite a number of potential issues which I think Mr. Fogg has touched on would probably require some more consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I think, Mr. Fogg, we can agree to delegate these matters to you and Mr. Harrison on the basis you can come back to Councillor Gray and Councillor Anderson for further clarification. Are you happy with that, Mr. Fogg? Right. And you're content with that, so thank you very much indeed for your attendance. Thank you. Moving on, colleagues, we will to the last item. Thank you, Mina. It all worked perfectly. Thank you. We move now to item 5.2, which is the erection of cider juice production building with pick your own facility and farm shop, siting of an accommodation unit for a temporary period, erection of a polytunnel and formation of vehicular access, parking and associated works. Land 100 metres south of 3 Gowrie Farm, Stanley. Now, I know there are two very patient people here in connection with this one, so thank you for your patience. Mr. Harrison, can I ask you to introduce this application for review?
Thank you, Convener. As you say, it's a detailed planning application for the erection of a cider/juice production building with pick your own facility and farm shop, the siting of an accommodation unit for a temporary period, the erection of a polytunnel, and the formation of vehicular access, parking and associated works at land 100 metres south of 3 Gowrie Farm by Stanley. The site extends to some 3.8 hectares and generally slopes up from the public road with the exception of a central elevated plateau. It is set in farmland with the exception of the houses on the site of the former farm. The B9099 runs along the southern boundary. And I'll just take you through the photographs very quickly just to remind you. This is, as you know, us approaching the site itself from the, shall we say, the Stanley side, up the public road looking in an easterly direction. And then more or less opposite the proposed access looking back in a westerly direction to where we've just been in the previous photograph. And this gives you an indication of the position of the buildings on that plateau as seen from the public road. And then this is approximately in the position of the access point, slightly downhill and opposite the existing houses. And moving into the site, so it's looking back down to the lower area, as it were, below the plateau, and looking in a westerly direction, and then swinging around a little bit from that, the lower area, and then the slope that takes us up to the plateau, where we walk through the gate, as I'm sure you can remember, and then that plateau and the rising ground beyond that. So, as it were, moving into the site, this is some of the early planting and the hedging that's been done. Swinging round to the left of that photograph, we look across the plateau to the various positions of the approximate positions, that is, of the buildings that are really the thing that form the part of the planning application, as it were. And swinging round to the left of that, we've got the planting adjacent to the deer fencing. This is us again looking from the opposite direction across the position of the buildings, but then swinging down to the left of that, we see the slope rising up to the upper level of the site, and some of the planting which has already been undertaken. And again swinging to the left of that, and going up the slope is us looking back down to the upper area of the orchard planting. Swinging round slightly to the left of that, we look down that boundary, that northern boundary, towards the redeveloped farm buildings. Then moving from that position down towards the buildings, we see more of the planting that's taken place, and again from there looking back towards the plateau and down towards the public road. Swinging round to the left of that photograph, we catch the other area which we saw when we were there, which is envisaged for the flower growing. And moving on from that, we go right to the far end of the application site, that's the eastern end, looking down the boundary with the garden ground of the houses, and then swinging to the left of that, that flower planting area again, and again to the left of that, the access road which goes up to the housing area. So I'll just leave you with that general photograph. Turning first of all in summary to the applicant's case, the applicant has made a significant investment in the purchase of the land, the planting of fruit trees and hedging, and the erection of fencing. The following aspects of the proposal are put forward in response to the reasons for refusal. The buildings would be partially set into the rising ground and would be of a design and quality of materials in keeping with the character of the area. Secondly, the proposal is seen as an improvement to the natural environment to the site through the existing and proposed planting. Thirdly, the applicant has taken advice from apple growing experts. The site is seen as unique and understood to have been an orchard for the Lasogurri apple cultivar in the past. Fourthly, the level of production is inevitably low at the formative stage, when it's necessary to import apples to supplement the cider making business. Fifthly, the proposed temporary accommodation would save the applicant having to commute from Aberfeldy and would provide security. If granted consent for a 3-year period, this would enable the applicant to demonstrate that the business was established. Thereafter, the provision of further temporary or permanent accommodation could be assessed by the council at that stage. Sixthly, the proposed residential building is not seen as isolated, as it forms part of the group of buildings at this location. Other positions within the 10-acre site have been considered and assessed as less suitable due to their elevation, gradient, access, provision of security, and proximity to existing houses. In addition, regarding the operations, the processing and filling of bottles would be by hand rather than by machinery, and the milling of apples would be no louder than a ride-on lawnmower in a few days of each year. These activities would be carried out inside the proposed building. Further, the project is seen as having benefits for the local community in terms of employment, capital expenditure, enhancement of the landscape, and increased biodiversity. Finally, matters relating to archaeological evaluation, access, water, landscaping, the establishment of the orchard, and provision of temporary accommodation could be addressed through planning conditions and/or a Section 75 agreement. The applicant considers that the review submission has responded to the reasons for refusal with supplementary information which addresses the concerns expressed in the report of handling, and that planning permission can be granted. Turning to the officer's summary of the officer's report of handling, the proposal relates to an emerging new fruit orchard and lavender plant enterprise on agricultural land. The existing and proposed planting of trees and hedges, which forms the principal land use and the basis for the enterprise, does not require planning permission. It is the buildings, access and parking, and potentially the retail aspect that require the benefit of planning permission. The report of handling considers the information submitted in the applicant's business plan covering prospective employment, cider and fruit production, visitor attraction, the range of items for sale, and lavender products. The officer concludes that there is a form of business from a combination of the various revenue streams, but it is very much at an early stage rather than being established as required by the local development plan policy. The applicant's proposal is viewed as highly ambitious, and the degree of success is not fully demonstrated, recognising that fairly significant investment would be involved with low initial returns. Out with settlements, local development plan policy may be supportive of business proposals where these diversify an existing business or are related to a site-specific resource or opportunity. While noting that the applicant considers this land as being suitable for fruit growing, a large proportion of rural Perthshire has suitable ground conditions for this purpose. The submission has not demonstrated that the specific conditions at this site are more advantageous, identifiable or unique in comparison to sites elsewhere. Consequently, the proposal is seen as being in conflict with Local Development Plan Policy ED3. Regarding the ability of the buildings to be accommodated within the landscape, the recent planting of hedges and trees within the site is noted. However, the proposed buildings would occupy an elevated and open position relative to the public road and unrelated to the houses at the former Gowrie farm. The proposed use may have an adverse impact on residential amenity. The proposed temporary accommodation units needs to be assessed against the economic activity criteria of the Housing in the Countryside Guide. It is not considered that the need for a local or key worker on site has been demonstrated, as there is neither a consented nor established economic activity at this location. In addition, the guidance requires such accommodation to be sited where there are long established landscape boundaries, and states that the subdivision of fields and newly planted hedges and trees are not accepted as creating such sites. In conclusion, the proposal is not assessed as being supported by Local Development Plan Policy RD3 or any of the categories within the Housing in the Countryside Guide 2012, specifically due to the lack of an established economic activity and a suitably robust degree of landscape containment. At this point, I would draw your attention to further information that has been submitted since the consideration of this previously. The Interim Development Quality Manager's response to the new information submitted with the notice review and the applicant's comments on those comments, including clarification in relation to the Community Council's late submission, are available on pages 2015 onwards. In this case, there was a request for a site visit, but no request for a hearing.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Harrison. Are there any questions for officers in the application for review? Councillor Anderson.
No questions.
Councillor Gray.
No questions.
I too have no questions, colleagues, so we can move to debate. We can proceed to determine the application's review on the basis of the information before us, that is, the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor, or do we require more information? Councillor Anderson, you're happy to proceed? Yes. Okay. So, having considered the applicant's papers, the report of handling, the Perth Kinross Local Development Plan and all other relevant material planning considerations, can I ask you, Councillor Gray, to start us off?
Yep.
Microphone, Tom.
Sorry, keep forgetting this thing. I see in this an old chestnut of mine arising. And that is that adjacent to this site, and in fact created by the development I'm about to refer to, is this opportunity. Should have been there in the first place. I deeply regret that such farmsteadings and houses are converted into nothing but houses, and the opportunity for rural enterprise is removed from the countryside. I find it a shocking mistake. The specific resource here is opportunity. That's the resource which becomes available with this, because there are many people who have the desire to live and work in the countryside. They simply cannot find a home with a piece of land attached to it. And here we have a developed steading which is filled by people who do not have any raison d'etre to be in that location other than desire to be there. They are not working adjacent to that farm, and that is a sad loss. We have lost many opportunities by such a crazy farm development in planning, one which I've resented since day one of joining this council and before. And this is an opportunity, and it should be grasped. And it is nevertheless caught between a rock and a hard place, in that it is a growing opportunity. It's not like fill a field with cows and they'll be fat and you can sell it at the end of the year and obviously you've got an enterprise. It is one where you're growing. It starts from the beginning of putting up fences and ensuring that the hedges are there and everything else is in place, and giving it time to develop. And in that time, to my mind, it is very deserved of opportunity to do that. And supposing it takes 3 years to get some way, even if it took another 3 years before the planning department is convinced that it is a viable opportunity, then I still suggest we should approve this application and look forward to seeing it develop. As I say, conditioned for 3 years and conditioned again. It's not for me to say at this point in time, but if it was conditioned again, just to prove the point that it is viable, if that's what it takes.
Thank you very much, Councillor Graham. You're glad you got that off your chest, you know. Councillor Anderson.
Yes, I would concur with Councillor Gray. The land that this orchard plan is on is predominantly south-facing, which means that it is ideal for growing fruit and apples, etc. There's much land in Perthshire that you wouldn't be able to get that on, so it has been looked at carefully, and in my view, with my limited agricultural background, I would say that it is the perfect place for an operation such as that. It's going to be a slow emerging business. Level of production will be low to start with, and it's good that it seems as if the applicant has planned well ahead, hence this application coming forward. And it may be that the planning officers haven't maybe taken that, the fact that it's an emerging business that's going to start small, but the people are planning. There is going to be a need for a temporary accommodation, because once you have a shop and you're doing cider, etc., there will be a security aspect to this. Whether, as Councillor Gray, 3 years is long enough or not, who knows? I wouldn't like to comment on that, but I would certainly uphold the application as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you very much, Councillor Anderson. I have to say I'm torn with this one, colleagues. The site visit was most interesting. I've already remarked on your patience of sitting through hours and hours of the local review body, but your patience is also evidenced in the amount of work that has been put into this enterprise. As a drive past, you might think that nothing much is happening, but having been round the site, you've certainly been very, very busy. My difficulty is whether this business is established or whether it is being established. But as Councillor Gray says, we need a bit of ambition, and due to decisions in the past regarding steadying developments, opportunities to do what you're trying to do are very, very limited in this area and elsewhere. So, although I'm very torn in terms of arithmetic, it doesn't actually matter what I think on this occasion, but I will also concur with the agreement that we should be given every encouragement with this enterprise. And I will also go to set aside the reasons for refusal. So, Mr. Fogg, do you have sufficient information from us? We will delegate the writing the final stuff to you, but...
Yes, can I clarify whether this is really being approved as a departure from development plan policies, or do you take a different view and say it's essentially compliant with plan policies? Perhaps you could just give a bit more of a steer for the decision notice to be drafted after today.
Well, I'll take advice from Councillor Gray, but I feel that we are going for a departure on the basis that this.
It's a bespoke.
Yes, it's a one-off enterprise.
Okay.
And whilst I have sympathy with planning officers who have to stick absolutely to the rules and regulations, we can set aside reasons for this, and this is a one-off bespoke enterprise. Which has to be given an opportunity, and as Councillor Gray says, if after 3 years things don't pan out as we wish, then we can look at it again. You know.
Yeah, my feeling is it does not yet. It's not quite within planning policies for reasons I gave. It just doesn't fit, but I do believe strongly that it needs to fit, and hopefully one day we'll get round to actually making such things fit. And this one's caught in the middle there.
Yeah. And again, I haven't really given thought to appropriate conditions to any great extent. I know to Councillor Gray that 3 years might not actually be sufficient to demonstrate the viability of the business, and it might be wrong for the applicant to assume that it could be made permanent thereafter, and a further opportunity to extend beyond that might be appropriate. But that's a decision not for today, but for a later date.
Could I add one particular condition, is that the access from the public road would not be made would be on a condition as well. Sorry, the access from the public road would not be put in place, because once that access is created in a public road, it would then deem the thing a permanent feature. Do you understand?
Yeah.
The access currently is from the farm track, or the old farm track.
And sorry, are you approving it with the exception of the formation of the proposed access and requiring it to be continued?
At this stage, yeah.
Right. Okay. Perhaps, again, Mr. Harrison could comment, given his greater knowledge of the site, about that aspect of...
Over to you, Mr. Harrison.
I have to say, I find the difficulty. First of all, the actual application is for the whole thing as an entity, and the Roads Authority do not have a concern as to the provision of the access in terms of visibility or other, should we say, public road safety matters. So,
right then, we are putting on the overall thing, we're putting a limitation of 3 years. Is that correct then?
That's what's been applied for. 3 year
okay, so that would include access anyway.
No, the temporary consent aspect relates to the accommodation, and solely the accommodation aspect of it. The other buildings are not, for example, subject to a time limitation. It's not been applied for in that context.
Yeah.
So you could have, if it wasn't proceeded with, you will have the access.
Yes, that's right. It would suddenly be a field with an access and presumably a made-up road to some extent, which becomes a permanent feature. which can be taken advantage of. Perhaps not in the way Council may have wished.
It's a risk.
It is a risk.
Perhaps check, Councillor Anderson, have you anything further to add?
No, I think if we're going to be brave enough to go with this decision, we have to put some trust in the applicants. That is the risk we take when we decide to overturn the officers.
That's fair point.
You know, and that's how I feel about it, Councillor Gray.
Yeah, I mean, are you happy with that, Councillor Gray? I mean, I think I share your concerns often with developments, but we're not quite going out on a limb with this, but we're hoping to encourage this new enterprise, and I think we have to go with that, I think. So with that, can I check, are you quite happy, Mr. Harrison, now with what we're doing, or?
As I said previously, I do, a matter of routine, have possible conditions you might like to consider. The first is there's a transport infrastructure contribution would be involved prior to consent being actually formally issued. The applicant has sort of put forward a suggestion of a Section 75 agreement regarding the planting of fruit trees as a submission of part of future business plans. Whether or not you think that is or isn't appropriate is something you might want to give a comment on. There is clearly going to need to be conditions in relation to clarifying the position in terms of access and provision of parking and turning. There's an archaeological evaluation seen as being required and informative in relation to water supplies. The drainage aspect may also require further information, and whether or not you feel further landscaping is seen as desirable over and above what has already clearly been undertaken is a consideration for you as well. Environmental health also had some concerns about the production aspects, but I say these may be matters that would need to be looked into in more detail before issuing a consent.
Convener, if I could just say, picking up from part of Mr. Harrison's comments there, in relation to Section 75, and it's correct, the applicants have suggested that, or their agents have. However, I'm mindful of government advice, which is planning agreements should be avoided where possible, and reliance made instead on planning conditions. My preference would be seek to deal with this through the conditions imposed on the planning consent, but should I become aware of a problem further down the line that requires it, then we could revert to Section 75 as the applicant indicated, but given the speed and avoidance of unnecessary expense both for the council and the applicants, with Section 5 would be preferring to try and avoid it if we could.
I think I would agree with avoiding Section 75s and anything else of that nature where possible, but I think with your agreement, colleagues, we can delegate the final stuff to you, Mr. Fogg, and to Mr. Harrison, with the proviso, as with the previous one, you can come back to us for any further information. So, thank you very much indeed. So that's the conclusion of the meeting. Thank you very much indeed.